My name is Violet Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've been described with words that sound like compliments: reliable, composed, unshakable. I'm a senior operations manager at a tech consulting firm in Boston. On paper, that sounds influential. In practice, it often meant I was the person who fixed problems quietly while someone else stood at the front of the room and took credit for the stability. If you met me in a meeting, you probably wouldn't remember me as the loudest voice. I don't interrupt. I don't posture. I don't perform confidence. I practice preparation. And in corporate culture, preparation is invisible until it isn't. People tend to underestimate women like me, especially when we don't announce our intelligence, especially when we choose calm over confrontation, especially when we don't look threatened. For years, I believed staying steady was enough. That competence would protect me. That integrity would speak for itself. This story begins on a Tuesday morning when I opened my laptop and realized my entire company email archive had been deleted. Not partially, not accidentally misplaced, deleted. Years of correspondence, client negotiations, internal strategy discussions, performance reviews, budget revisions. Every thread that documented not just my work, but decisions that weren't always mine. My boss called it a system cleanup. He didn't realize two things. First, I document everything. Second, I had already forwarded critical communications to my personal counsel weeks earlier. Not because I planned revenge, not because I wanted drama, because I had learned to listen when patterns repeat. This isn't a story about shouting in conference rooms or dramatic firings. It's not about destroying someone publicly. There are no villains here with theatrical evil speeches. It's about quiet dominance. It's about what happens when someone assumes control because they believe you don't have leverage. It's about the moment you realize erasing evidence only works if you're the only one who has it. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I became invisible in my own workplace, how small dismissals turned into strategic decisions, and how silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes the most powerful move in the room. No exaggerations, no revenge fantasies, just documented truth. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough that someone mistook your silence for weakness? To understand what happened later, you need to understand who I was in that office before anything shifted. I was the stabilizer. That's what they called me during performance reviews. Violet keeps everything running. Violet catches what others miss. We don't have to worry when she's involved. It sounded flattering, and at first it was. I joined the firm at 28, fresh from a smaller operations role, hungry to prove myself. The company was scaling fast. New clients, new hires, new revenue streams, and chaos followed growth like a shadow. I stepped into that chaos and organized it. I built process maps, I restructured onboarding systems, I quietly rewrote vendor contracts to close gaps no one had noticed. I didn't need applause, I needed order. In meetings, I usually sat halfway down the table, not at the head, not in the back. I took notes no one asked for. I sent follow-up emails summarizing decisions people didn't realize they'd made. When tensions rose between departments, I translated emotions into action items. Over time, people began looping me into everything. Run it by Violet. Can Violet sanity check this? Let's have Violet review before we send. I became the internal insurance policy. But there was something subtle underneath the praise. No one said, let's have Violet present this to the client. No one said, Violet should lead this strategy call. No one said this was Violet's framework. Instead, I was the infrastructure, useful, essential, invisible. My boss, Daniel, was charismatic in the way executives are trained to be. He could fill a room without raising his voice. He remembered birthdays. He remembered spouses' names. He also had a habit of summarizing team efforts using singular pronouns. I've been refining our operational model. I adjusted the risk structure. I decided we needed tighter documentation. I would sit there, listening to my own language come back to me in a different tone. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. The company was succeeding. My salary increased every year. I had autonomy. Daniel trusted me with sensitive projects. Trust is an interesting word. He trusted me with responsibility. He didn't always credit me with authorship. There's a difference. In the office hierarchy, I was perceived as steady but not threatening, competent but not ambitious, intelligent but not political. And I let them believe that, partly because it was easier. When you don't appear threatening, people talk freely around you. They forward emails they shouldn't. They assume you won't challenge inconsistencies. They copy you on threads because you're detail-oriented, not because you're powerful. Invisibility has its advantages, but it also reshapes how people treat you. Junior staff came to me for guidance. Senior leadership came to me for damage control. Clients sometimes thanked Daniel for frameworks I had spent weekends refining. I didn't correct them. Not out of fear, out of calculation. I was building something internal. Skills, relationships, documentation habits. I carried my navy leather notebook everywhere. Dates, decisions. Who approved what? Who declined what? Who changed the wording before it went out? It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Because when you are the quiet one in the room, you start noticing something else. People believe the quiet one won't defend herself, and that belief changes how bold they become. At that time, I didn't yet see where it was heading. I just knew that I was valuable and replaceable in the narrative at the same time. That's a dangerous position to occupy. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was simply observing. And sometimes the person observing the longest ends up knowing the most. The first cut wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or public humiliation. No one in the room would have labeled it disrespect. That's what made it important. It happened during a quarterly strategy review with a long-term healthcare client. I had spent 3 weeks restructuring their operational risk model after discovering inconsistencies in their vendor compliance reporting. It wasn't glamorous work. It was spreadsheets at midnight, legal footnotes, policy cross-referencing. But it mattered. The morning of the presentation, Daniel asked if I could tighten a few slides before we sent the deck. I did. I removed redundancies, clarified language, and added a risk exposure projection chart that made the numbers honest. When we walked into the conference room, I assumed, without thinking about it, that I would present the risk framework. After all, I had built it. Daniel opened the meeting smoothly, as usual. Warm introduction, light humor, confident pacing. Then we reached the operations section. He didn't pause. He didn't gesture toward me. He simply continued speaking. As I was reviewing your reporting structure last month, I noticed several compliance gaps. My chart appeared on the screen. My language, my phrasing, my structure. He spoke through it as if it had formed in his head organically, not maliciously, not aggressively, just seamlessly. I remember sitting there, hands folded loosely in my lap, nodding at the right moments. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even angry. But something registered. The client asked a technical follow-up question, one that required deeper explanation. Daniel hesitated, almost imperceptibly. I answered, calmly, directly, without claiming ownership. The client turned toward me and said, "That's a strong framework." Daniel smiled and replied, "Yes, we've been refining it carefully." That was the moment. A small word. A shared credit that erased individual authorship. The meeting ended successfully. The client signed a contract extension 2 weeks later. The company celebrated the retention. No one mentioned the risk model again. Back at the office, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Great support in there," he said. "You always catch the details." "Support," I nodded. Of course. And I meant it. But that evening, when I opened my Navy notebook, I wrote something new. Q2 Healthcare Review, presented by Daniel. Framework authored by VHW. Client acknowledgement redirected. I didn't write it out of bitterness. I wrote it because patterns begin as small incidents. If I had confronted him then, it would have seemed disproportionate. Petty, even. It was just a meeting, just wording, just phrasing. Everyone else moved on. But I replayed the moment later that night, not with resentment, but with curiosity. Was it intentional? Or was it habitual? There's a difference. Intentional disrespect is sharp and obvious. Habitual erasure is softer, more dangerous. It becomes normalized before you notice it's happening. The next day, Daniel forwarded a company-wide email praising the team for the healthcare retention. My name appeared in the third paragraph under Operations Support. I stared at the word support longer than necessary. That was the first cut. Small enough to ignore, precise enough to remember. And once you notice the first cut, you start watching for the second. The second cut didn't feel like a cut at all. That's how normalization works. It arrived disguised as busyness. A month after the healthcare presentation, we began onboarding a fintech client with a volatile compliance history. The contract was high value and politically sensitive. Daniel told me privately, "We need this to go smoothly. I trust you." Trust again. He assigned me to redesign their reporting cadence, build internal audit checkpoints, and coordinate between legal and engineering. It was layered work, technical and relational at the same time. I spent late evenings drafting communication templates that would prevent misinterpretation later. When the internal kickoff meeting happened, I expected the usual dynamic. I would speak when technical clarification was required. Instead, something slightly different unfolded. Daniel introduced the project structure as something leadership had mapped out. Leadership, plural, vague. He referenced our design philosophy without specifying contributors. When I began outlining the escalation pathway I had built, he gently interjected. Not to contradict me, but to reframe my explanation. "Right," he said. "What Violet means is," he didn't misrepresent my words. He softened them, simplified them, adjusted tone. The room nodded along. It was subtle, almost protective in appearance, as if he were translating my technical precision into executive language. After the meeting, one of the newer managers approached me and said, "It's great how Daniel can take complex systems and make them simple." I smiled. Because technically, yes, but the system had already been built. That evening, I opened my notebook again. FinTech kickoff. Escalation, pathway reframed. Attribution diffused. Tone redirected. Still no anger. Just documentation. The third cut came 2 weeks later. It's an internal budget review meeting. I had flagged a potential misallocation in a vendor retainer, small enough to overlook, large enough to compound over time. I emailed Daniel the breakdown beforehand. In the meeting, he presented the cost-saving adjustment as a proactive correction he had identified during review. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. By then, a pattern had formed. Each instance alone was defensible, explainable, ambiguous. But repetition removes ambiguity. And here's where it becomes complicated. I began rationalizing it. I told myself this is how executive layering works. Senior leaders present consolidated decisions. Attribution becomes collective. Visibility shifts upward. I told myself it didn't matter as long as the work was strong. I told myself I wasn't interested in spotlight politics anyway. But internally, something more honest surfaced. It wasn't about applause. It was about narrative ownership. When your contributions are consistently reframed as support rather than authorship, the organizational memory reshapes itself. Over time, people don't consciously diminish you. They simply forget where things originated. And once narrative memory shifts, power follows it. I noticed something else, too. Daniel's requests became more frequent and more urgent. "Can you draft this quickly? Can you outline something for me before 3 p.m.? Send me bullet points I can reference." Reference. He wasn't stealing, he was sourcing. And because I responded calmly every time, because I never objected publicly, because I didn't challenge language in meetings, the pattern solidified. Silence was being interpreted as consent. But I wasn't silent because I felt small. I was silent because I was studying the structure. There is a difference between tolerating disrespect and mapping it. At the time, no one, including Daniel, realized which one I was doing. There's a moment in every professional dynamic when you realize you've been cast. Not hired, cast. The realization didn't arrive with confrontation. It came during an annual leadership offsite in Vermont. 2 days of strategy sessions, catered meals, and polished optimism. Whiteboards filled with growth projections, words like scalability, synergy, and integration. I facilitated 3 of the breakout workshops, not because I was the most senior person in the room, because I was the most organized. Daniel introduced me that morning as the operational backbone of our company. Backbone. It sounds strong, structural, essential, but backbones aren't visible in photographs. During one breakout, I noticed something interesting. When the discussion drifted, people looked to me to redirect it. When tension rose between finance and product, I translated their disagreement into actionable steps. When time ran short, I summarized decisions clearly enough that no one could dispute what had been agreed upon. I was managing the room without holding the title, and that's when it clicked. My assigned role wasn't a leader. It was a stabilizer, reliable, useful, invisible. At dinner that evening, I overheard two directors talking near the fireplace. "Daniel's vision is what keeps us competitive," one said. "And Violet makes sure it actually works," the other replied. It wasn't malicious. It was observational. But the hierarchy was embedded in that sentence. Vision above, execution below. Authorship above, infrastructure below. I went back to my hotel room and stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not examining my appearance, examining my positioning. Had I unintentionally reinforced this role? I rarely corrected misattributions. I avoided spotlight moments. When clients praised something I built, I redirected to the team. When Daniel summarized frameworks I authored, I didn't clarify publicly. I had believed humility would protect credibility. Instead, it was shaping perception. The next morning, Daniel pulled me aside before the closing session. "I need you to take notes during the investor Q&A," he said. "You capture nuance better than anyone." Of course I did, because I was listening to everything. He stepped onto the stage for the final presentation. Investors nodded, slides advanced, growth projections projected confidence. I watched from the side of the room, pen moving steadily across paper. It wasn't resentment I felt. It was clarity. Roles become permanent when you don't renegotiate them. And renegotiation doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires repositioning. The question forming in my mind wasn't, "Why doesn't he credit me?" It was more precise. What happens if this narrative continues for 5 more years? Organizational memory would eventually record Daniel as an architect, me as operations support. And if anything ever went wrong, support is easier to replace. That night, before leaving Vermont, I added a new section to my notebook. Not dates, not incidents, a header. Risk exposure, it's personal. Because for the first time, I understood something important. The role I was assigned benefited the company. It did not necessarily protect me. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a public misattribution or a strategic presentation. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening when almost everyone had already left the office. I stayed late that night, reviewing an internal audit draft tied to a government subcontract. The compliance language was delicate. There were reporting obligations that required precise documentation trails. I was cross-referencing archived emails to ensure alignment between what had been promised and what had been delivered. That's when I noticed the first inconsistency. A timeline adjustment in a client-facing document that didn't match the original approval thread. It wasn't catastrophic, it wasn't fraud, it was revisionist framing. Language had shifted slightly between internal approval and external communication. Responsibility had been repositioned. Deadlines had been described as mutually adjusted rather than vendor delayed. The change benefited optics. It also blurred accountability. I scrolled through older email threads to trace the origin of the edit. My name appeared on early drafts. Daniel appeared on final approvals. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the removal of certain internal clarifications, notes that indicated risk awareness before decisions were finalized. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle. For the first time, I wasn't looking at isolated cuts. I was looking at pattern architecture, narrative positioning. Credit flowed upward. Risk documentation softened outward. Operational authorship diluted. And suddenly, a quiet but firm realization landed. If something ever escalated legally or financially, documentation would matter more than memory. And memory, in corporate structures, bends toward hierarchy. That was the shift. Not anger, not fear, assessment. I opened my notebook, not to record another instance of reframed credit, but to outline a new approach. Up until then, I had documented privately for clarity. That night, documentation became strategic. I began organizing digital folders on my personal encrypted drive, not to hoard information, but to preserve correspondence tied to my direct authorship and compliance advisories. I forwarded key threads, not everything, just critical decision pathways, to my personal email account for redundancy. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. It was quiet risk mitigation. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with an external compliance attorney I had met years earlier during a certification seminar. I framed it casually, just ensuring best practices regarding documentation retention in leadership roles. He listened carefully. "Are you anticipating a dispute?" he asked. "No," I said honestly. "I'm anticipating ambiguity." There's a difference. Ambiguity is where accountability dissolves. That was the moment something fundamental changed inside me. Before that night, my silence had been observational. After that night, my silence became deliberate. I stopped assuming the system would naturally align with fairness. Instead, I began preparing for structural drift. In meetings, I continued speaking calmly. I continued summarizing decisions. I continued sending follow-up emails. But the language shifted slightly. Where I once wrote, "Per discussion, we've decided," I began writing, "As confirmed by Daniel at 2:14 p.m., the decision is clear, precise, time-stamped. No accusations, just clarity." No one noticed the shift. Why would they? It didn't feel confrontational. It felt administrative. But internally, a line had been drawn. Not against Daniel, against risk. And when you quietly decide to protect yourself, the energy in your body changes. You're no longer hoping to be recognized. You're ensuring you cannot be erased. After that Thursday night, my behavior didn't change dramatically. That was intentional. The most powerful repositioning is often invisible at first. I still arrived early, still carried my Navy notebook, still responded to urgent Slack messages with composed efficiency. If anything, I appeared even steadier than before. But internally, silence was no longer the default. It was strategic. There's a difference between being quiet because you trust the structure and being quiet because you understand the structure. In meetings, I began speaking slightly less, but writing slightly more. When Daniel asked for bullet points before a presentation, I sent them in structured emails with clear headers and phrasing that subtly reflected authorship. Below is the framework I've developed for tomorrow's discussion. Not confrontational, not defensive, just linguistically precise. If he chose to present it as his own, the documentation trail would tell a fuller story. I also stopped over-explaining verbally. Previously, if someone misunderstood a nuance in a meeting, I would jump in immediately to clarify. Now, I allowed silence to stretch a few seconds longer. If clarification was necessary, I followed up afterward in writing. Just to ensure alignment, my original recommendation included. The shift was almost imperceptible to others, but perception started changing in small ways. Colleagues who once casually redirected technical questions to Daniel began looping me directly in follow-up emails. "Violet, can you confirm your model assumptions here?" Your model. Language reveals recognition before titles do. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed comfortable, perhaps even more comfortable. My calm had never threatened him. My precision had always supported him. He didn't interpret my silence as repositioning. He interpreted it as loyalty. That was the quiet miscalculation. Because silence, when chosen consciously, gathers information. I noticed more than before. I noticed how often Daniel revised language in final documents to soften accountability. I noticed which board members preferred direct updates. I noticed which clients forwarded internal correspondence carelessly. I wasn't collecting secrets. I was mapping influence pathways. There is something psychologically interesting about being perceived as non-threatening. People relax around you. They speak openly. They forward drafts without hesitation. They assume you are not playing a long game. And I wasn't playing a game. I was building insulation. At the same time, I began strengthening relationships outside the company's internal hierarchy. Casual coffee meetings with compliance officers at partner firms, industry roundtables, continuing education seminars. If the narrative inside the company framed me as support, the narrative outside needed to reflect authorship. One afternoon, Daniel joked during a team huddle, If Violet ever leaves, we'd probably collapse. The room laughed. I smiled too. But something about that sentence settled differently this time. If I ever leave, the assumption was that departure would be my decision, not theirs. That assumption would matter later. Because here's the truth. When you are perceived as stable infrastructure, people forget infrastructure has agency. They forget it can disconnect. They forget it has backups. My silence became a choice not to escalate prematurely. It also became a choice to let patterns mature long enough to be undeniable. And when patterns mature, they leave trails. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. By the time summer arrived, no one would have described me as different. I was still the person who caught inconsistencies before contracts went out. Still the one who remembered which client preferred Friday updates and which board member disliked surprise attachments. But behind that steady rhythm, I had started building something far more deliberate. First, I organized authorship. Every major framework I developed now existed in 3 places: the company server, a time-stamped email thread referencing my original draft, and a personal archive folder labeled simply Professional Record. Not everything, only material tied to compliance advisories, operational risk modeling, and documented decision approvals. If something was casual, it stayed casual. If something carried liability exposure, it was preserved. Second, I refined language. I stopped saying, "we decided," unless it was genuinely collaborative. Instead, I wrote, "As discussed, Daniel approved moving forward with, at 3:42 p.m., leadership confirmed the revision." No accusation, just clarity. Over time, something subtle shifted in email threads. Others began adopting similar precision. When documentation becomes normalized, it protects everyone. Daniel didn't resist this shift. In fact, he seemed to appreciate it. It made processes look more disciplined. Investors liked discipline. He didn't notice that discipline also creates traceability. The third layer of preparation was relational. I scheduled a quiet lunch with a former colleague who now worked in regulatory compliance for a state oversight board. I framed it as catching up. We talked about industry trends, audit triggers, and documentation best practices. One sentence she said stayed with me. Companies don't fall apart because of one bad decision. They fall apart because documentation doesn't match narrative. Documentation doesn't match the narrative. I already knew that, but hearing it externally confirmed something inside me. Back at the office, I started paying closer attention to final versions of outbound communication, small phrasing edits that shifted responsibility from leadership to process evolution, language that implied mutual agreement where urgency had actually been internal. None of it was explosive. But over time, small shifts accumulate into structural distortion. And here's what they never noticed. I stopped emotionally investing in recognition. That freed cognitive space. When you are no longer hoping to be credited, you become extraordinarily clear-eyed about risk. One afternoon, I stayed late reviewing archived project folders for retention policy alignment. IT had recently migrated part of our email server to a new system. Some older threads were flagged for deletion under a storage optimization policy. I requested clarification from IT in writing. Can you confirm whether archived executive correspondence tied to client compliance advisories is included in this cleanup? They responded vaguely. We're following leadership guidance. Leadership guidance? I forwarded that response to myself, not out of fear, out of pattern recognition. Around this time, Daniel began consolidating access permissions. Fewer people had editing rights to shared folders. He framed it as efficiency. We don't need too many hands in the system. Reasonable. But I quietly exported my authored project files before permissions shifted, just in case. The interesting part is this. I didn't feel anxious. I felt calm. Preparedness removes panic from possibility. And because I didn't confront, didn't accuse, didn't escalate, no one suspected I was insulating myself. In fact, Daniel started leaning on me more. I appreciate how steady you are, he said during one late meeting. Some people get emotional when things get complex. I held eye contact and replied gently, complexity rewards documentation. He smiled. He thought I meant process improvement. I meant accountability. By early fall, I had something invaluable. A clean, chronological, time-stamped record of operational authorship and decision approvals tied to compliance-sensitive projects. Not a weapon, a mirror. And mirrors only become threatening when someone is afraid of reflection. The reveal didn't come with a confrontation. It came with a login error. It was a Tuesday morning. Ordinary, gray, uneventful. I arrived at the office at 7:40 a.m., placed my Navy notebook on my desk, opened my laptop, and tried to access an archived client thread tied to the government subcontract. The folder was empty. At first, I assumed it was a sync issue. IT migrations sometimes created temporary visibility gaps. I refreshed. Still empty. I navigated to my general email archive. Years of correspondence gone. Not hidden. Not partially filtered. Gone. A system notification banner appeared at the top of my inbox. Storage optimization update completed. I sat very still. No rush of adrenaline, no visible reaction. Just assessment. I walked down the hallway to IT. Morning, I said calmly. I'm missing archived correspondence going back several years. Is that part of the migration? The technician hesitated just slightly before answering. We were instructed to clean legacy executive archives that weren't marked for retention. Instructed by? I asked gently. Leadership. Leadership. The word had become almost abstract by then. I returned to my desk and opened Slack. A company-wide message from Daniel had been posted 30 minutes earlier. To streamline server performance, we've completed an archive cleanup aligned with our updated data retention policy. Moving forward, all critical documentation should live in centralized project folders. Clean, efficient, administrative. My hands remained steady on the keyboard, because here's what Daniel didn't know. Weeks earlier, after the Vermont offsite, after the IT migration warning, after the subtle permission consolidations, I had already forwarded compliance-sensitive threads, authorship drafts, and time-stamped approval emails to my personal counsel. Not because I expected deletion, because I expected ambiguity. Erasing evidence only works if you're the only one who has it. I opened my encrypted personal drive and cross-checked. Everything critical was there. Not every email, not gossip, not casual threads, only decision pathways tied to risk exposure and narrative ownership. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Quick sync at 9? Of course. At 9 a.m., I walked into his office carrying only my notebook. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed. Just housekeeping, he said. We're tightening data hygiene. Some old archives weren't aligned with policy. I nodded. That makes sense, I replied. He studied my face briefly, perhaps expecting confusion or pushback. There was none. Let me know if you're missing anything operationally critical, he added. Operationally critical. Interesting phrasing. I've maintained backups of key compliance advisories, I said evenly, so continuity shouldn't be an issue. It was a truthful statement, but layered. He paused. Backups? He asked casually. Yes, I replied. Best practice, especially on government-adjacent projects. Silence. Not hostile. Measured. Then he smiled lightly. Good. Always thorough. I left his office understanding something with absolute clarity. The deletion hadn't been random. It had been selective. Executive-level correspondence only. Archives that documented narrative evolution. Maybe he believed it reduced clutter. Maybe he believed it reduced liability. Maybe he believed no one else had copies. What mattered wasn't his intention. What mattered was the asymmetry he assumed. He believed control of the server equaled control of history. He didn't account for quite enough foresight. Back at my desk, I scheduled a call with my attorney for that afternoon. Not to threaten, not to escalate, to document. Has anything material changed? He asked. Yes, I said calmly. Original executive correspondence archives have been deleted under leadership directive. And you have independent copies? I do. A brief pause. Good, he replied. Then you're insulated. Insulated. That was the word. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted internally. Not because I confronted, not because I exposed, but because the assumption of erasure no longer applies. Quiet dominance isn't about striking first. It's about ensuring that when someone attempts to rewrite the record still exists, privately, permanently, and patiently. There's a moment after you realize you're insulated when you have to decide what to do with that insulation. Having leverage and using leverage are not the same thing. For several days after the archive deletion, I did nothing visibly different. I attended meetings. I finalized project timelines. I sent follow-up emails with the same measured tone I had always used. But internally, a quiet evaluation was unfolding. Option 1, say nothing. Keep working. Treat the deletion as administrative overreach and move forward with caution. Option 2, confront Daniel directly. Ask why executive correspondence had been selectively erased. Force a conversation about accountability. Option 3, escalate formally. Board level, legal level, regulatory level. Each path carried consequences. Silence preserved stability but normalized risk. Confrontation could trigger defensiveness without resolution. Escalation would be irreversible. And here's the part most people misunderstand about power. The strongest move is not the loudest one. It's the one you can sustain. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want spectacles. I didn't want to win in a dramatic sense. I wanted structural clarity. So I did something that looked small. I requested a written copy of the updated data retention policy, not casually, formally. Per last week's archive cleanup, could you please share the finalized retention framework and approval documentation for executive correspondence deletion? Clear, neutral, documented. Daniel responded an hour later. Policy aligns with IT best practices, nothing unusual. No attachment, no documentation, just reassurance. I replied gently. For compliance alignment on government-adjacent contracts, I'll need written confirmation of policy parameters and leadership sign-off. Thank you. That email was the fork in the road. Because once you request written confirmation tied to compliance exposure, ambiguity becomes risk. He didn't respond that afternoon or the next morning. Instead, at 3:17 p.m. the following day, I received a calendar invite titled Executive Data Governance Review. Attendees, Daniel, CFO, Head of IT, me. That told me everything. If the deletion had been purely procedural, a simple PDF would have sufficed. A meeting meant recalibration. Before walking into that conference room, I called my attorney. I'm not escalating, I told him. I'm clarifying. Good, he said. Staying questions, not accusations. That was always the plan. In the meeting, Daniel opened with composure. Violet raised a valid point about documentation clarity, he began. We want to ensure alignment. Valid point. Language shift. IT presented a generalized retention slide deck. No specific clause referenced executive-level deletions. No documented approval memo was provided. I asked only 3 questions. Who authorized the archive scope? What criteria distinguished executive correspondence from general archives? Where is the written record of that authorization? Silence stretched slightly longer than usual. The CFO looked at Daniel. Daniel answered carefully. We can formalize that documentation retroactively. Retroactively. There it was. Narrative attempting to catch up to action. I nodded calmly. That would be helpful, I said. I didn't mention backups. I didn't mention counsel. I didn't accuse. I simply documented. That evening, I made my decision. Not to escalate publicly. Not yet. But to formally preserve my position outside the company's internal hierarchy. I authorized my attorney to draft a sealed advisory memorandum documenting the timeline of archive deletion and prior compliance communications. It would remain private, unless needed, irreversible. Because once legal documentation exists externally, history cannot be quietly rewritten. I wasn't attacking. I was anchoring truth beyond the server. And anchors don't make noise. They just prevent drift. Once the sealed advisory memorandum existed, something subtle changed inside me. Not urgency, not fear, control. I understood something Daniel didn't. The moment documentation leaves internal systems and enters an external legal record, it becomes immune to internal revision. And yet, outwardly, nothing about me suggested escalation. I continued arriving early, continued facilitating meetings, continued summarizing decisions in calm, neutral language. If anything, I became even more composed. Because when you're anchored, you don't react. You observe. 2 weeks after the data governance meeting, Daniel circulated a refined retention policy. It was newly time-stamped. Executive correspondence was now categorized under broader archival discretion, requiring dual authorization. Forward-looking compliance. No reference to what had already been deleted. I replied with a simple acknowledgement. Thank you for formalizing. No challenge, no reminder. But privately, I forwarded the updated policy to my attorney, not as evidence of wrongdoing, as a continuation of the record. Meanwhile, I began strengthening something else: optionality. I updated my professional portfolio, not publicly, not on LinkedIn with dramatic announcements, but in a private document outlining authored frameworks, compliance advisories, and risk mitigation structures I had led. For the first time, I described my work using unfiltered language: architected, designed, implemented, not supported, not assisted, authored. I also reached out to 2 external industry contacts I trusted, individuals who had previously hinted at advisory opportunities. I'm exploring long-term structural roles, I wrote, particularly where compliance architecture and operational governance intersect. No urgency. No complaint about my current firm. Just signal. Within days, exploratory conversations were scheduled. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed relaxed. Perhaps he believed the governance meeting had resolved tension. Perhaps he assumed my request for documentation was procedural thoroughness. He continued leaning on me for high-stakes deliverables. One afternoon, he forwarded me a sensitive client escalation thread with a note. Draft response for me? For you. I stared at the words for a moment. Then I responded. I can draft a response reflecting the operational reality and compliance exposure. Please confirm final approval language before sending. It was a small boundary, but clear. No more implicit authorship transfer without documented sign-off. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Even that mattered, because emojis timestamp intent. Around this time, I noticed something interesting. Senior staff had begun copying me directly on board-facing communications, not as support, but as primary contact for operational clarification. Recognition was shifting quietly, not loudly, not ceremonially, but perceptibly. Daniel adjusted slightly too. In one meeting, he said, Violet developed the underlying structure here. Developed? It wasn't a full authorship acknowledgement, but it was closer. The system was recalibrating in small degrees. Still, I didn't relax, because the archive deletion had revealed something irreversible. If narrative could be erased once, it could be attempted again, under pressure, under scrutiny, under financial strain. So I continued moving in silence. No public accusation, no gossip, no dramatic resignation threats. Just legal insulation, professional repositioning, and strategic patience. The irony was this: the quieter I became, the more stable I appeared. The more stable I appeared, the less anyone suspected I had already secured an exit path that did not depend on internal validation. Power doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation layered so cleanly that when consequences arrive, you don't scramble. You step aside and let gravity do the rest. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, like interest. About a month after the archive incident, a routine compliance review triggered something unexpected. The government-adjacent subcontract I had been monitoring was selected for a secondary documentation audit. Not an accusation, not an investigation, just a deeper review. Ordinarily, this wouldn't have rattled anyone. We had strong systems, structured reporting, clean processes, except now the original executive correspondence tied to early timeline adjustments no longer lived on the company's server. And auditors don't rely on memory. They rely on documentation continuity. The first sign of tension appeared in Daniel's posture during a prep meeting. Let's make sure everything aligns cleanly, he said, flipping through the updated retention policy. IT confirmed that post-cleanup archives were intact. But when the auditor requested historical approval threads for specific deadline revisions, threads that predated the cleanup, the room became slightly quieter. We migrated older correspondence under new storage constraints, Daniel explained smoothly. The auditor nodded. Understood. We'll need whatever remains accessible. Whatever remains accessible. That phrase hung in the air. Daniel turned to me. Violet, can you reconstruct the timeline from project folders? Reconstruct. As if memory could substitute primary record. I met his eyes calmly. I can provide operational drafts and final submissions, I said. Executive correspondence was part of the archive cleanup. He knew what that meant. I didn't need to elaborate. Over the next week, the absence of original threads became noticeable, not catastrophic, but inconvenient. Explanations required more verbal clarification. Context had to be narrated instead of shown. Auditors are trained to detect narrative reconstruction, not because they assume wrongdoing, because absence introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity increases scrutiny. Inside the office, subtle shifts began. The CFO requested more frequent documentation reviews. IT tightened logging protocols. Daniel's tone in meetings became more measured, less charismatic, more procedural. One afternoon, I overheard him speaking quietly with the CFO near the glass conference room. "Should have formalized it first," he murmured. I didn't need to hear more. Formalization retroactively always sounds cleaner than it feels. Meanwhile, something else unfolded. Two of the external advisory conversations I had initiated progressed unexpectedly quickly. One firm was expanding its governance division. They needed someone who could design compliance architecture from the ground up. "Your documentation discipline is impressive," one partner said during a call. "We rarely see operational leaders who think like this." I didn't mention archive deletions. I didn't mention internal recalibration. I simply described what I had built. And for the first time, I spoke about my work without minimizing it. Back at the office, Daniel called me into his office again. "Audit's a bit more detailed than expected," he said. "Nothing major, just paperwork noise." Paperwork noise. I nodded. "If needed," I said evenly, "I've maintained independent backups of compliance-related advisories for continuity." There it was again. Backup. The word landed differently this time. He held my gaze for a fraction longer than usual. "That's helpful," he said. Helpful, not threatening, not alarming, but clarifying, because consequences had begun, not as punishment, not as scandal, but as exposure to procedural gravity. When documentation disappears, even for benign reasons, confidence wavers. And when confidence wavers at the executive level, perception shifts. No one accused. No one panicked. But the atmosphere changed, and I remained exactly as I had always been. Calm, prepared, present. Because consequences don't require volume. They require absence. And absence had finally become visible. By the time the second auditor's email arrived, the tone had shifted. Not aggressive. Not accusatory. Precise. They requested confirmation of authorization timestamps tied to the original timeline revisions, specifically executive-level approval correspondence, not summaries, not reconstructed memos, original threads. The problem with retroactive formalization is that it can tidy policy, but it cannot recreate deleted history. In the conference room, the CFO reviewed the request twice before speaking. "We'll need to provide something," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "We can draft a clarification memo." Clarification, not documentation. The difference was no longer subtle. I sat across the table, notebook open, pen resting lightly against the page. No one looked at me yet. They didn't need to. They knew what I had. And they knew I hadn't volunteered it publicly. After the meeting, Daniel asked me to stay behind. The door closed. He didn't sit this time. He stood near the window. "Violet," he began carefully, "do you still have access to older executive threads related to the subcontract?" There it was. Direct. I didn't rush to answer. "I maintain backups of compliance-sensitive advisories for continuity," I replied evenly. "Would you be willing to share them internally?" he asked. The question wasn't hostile. It was strained. Because once leverage becomes visible, tone changes. I chose my words deliberately. "I'm willing to ensure accurate documentation is available for audit purposes," I said, "provided it's transmitted formally and preserved appropriately." Formally, preserved, appropriately. He exhaled slowly. "You understand why we streamlined archives," he said. "It wasn't malicious." "I didn't assume it was," I replied calmly. And I meant that. Intent wasn't the issue. Irreversibility was. Here's what he understood in that moment. If I simply forwarded my backups to the company server without condition, the narrative could still be reframed. Context could still shift. If I transmitted them through counsel, timestamped and documented, the record would solidify beyond internal reinterpretation. It was too late to make the deletion invisible. Now it requires formal acknowledgement. That afternoon, I called my attorney. "They've requested the archived threads," I explained. Understood, he said. We'll transmit through formal legal correspondence to ensure continuity of record. Continuity of record. When the email was sent, CCing the company's general counsel, the tone changed immediately. Not explosive. Measured. Professional. But irrevocably documented. The cover letter referenced original authorship timestamps, archive deletion date, subsequent policy formalization, audit request identifiers. No accusations, just chronology. The next morning, the CFO thanked me in a tone that felt different than before. Appreciate your thoroughness, she said. Thoroughness. Daniel was quieter, not resentful, not angry, but aware, because something fundamental had shifted. Control of the narrative had moved from server access to a documented record. And once documentation enters legal channels, it cannot be quietly undone. Too late to erase. Too late to retroactively soften. Too late to pretend the archive cleanup had been purely administrative. No one was fired. No scandal erupted. But authority recalibrated. And recalibration leaves a mark. I walked back to my desk that day feeling something unexpected. Not victory. Relief. Because ambiguity had ended. The record existed. And from that point forward, everyone in leadership knew something simple. If history is altered, I will have a copy. Quietly. Permanently. The formal confrontation didn't look like a confrontation. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, no slammed doors. It happened in a scheduled one-on-one. Daniel requested a week after the audit materials were formally transmitted through counsel. His office felt different that afternoon, less expansive somehow. The glass walls didn't project authority the way they once had. He gestured for me to sit. I want to clear the air, he began. His tone wasn't defensive, it was careful. I didn't anticipate the archive cleanup would create this level of complication. I understand, I replied. And I did. Poor judgment doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from overconfidence. He folded his hands. You went through legal channels quickly. Yes, I said evenly. Once documentation continuity was in question, that felt appropriate. No accusation, just rationale. He nodded slowly. You could have come to me first. There it was. The unspoken expectation of loyalty. I held his gaze calmly. I did, I said. When I requested written confirmation of authorization, the response wasn't documented. Silence. Not hostile. Reflective. That was the difference now. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was referencing a sequence. He exhaled through his nose, a small acknowledgement of truth. I never intended to diminish your work, he said after a moment, if that's how it's felt. This was the closest we had come to addressing the deeper pattern. I didn't rush to reassure him. I don't require recognition, I replied gently. I require clarity. That sentence seemed to land, because recognition is ego-based. Clarity is structural. He leaned back slightly. You've been more guarded lately, he observed. Yes, I agreed, because ambiguity increases risk. There was no heat in the room, no bitterness. Just two professionals recalculating alignment. I value what you bring to this company, he said. You know that. I value building systems that protect everyone involved, I replied, including myself. I didn't say the last part aloud. He studied me for a long second. I'd like to reset, he said finally. More transparency, fewer assumptions. Reset. It sounded collaborative, but resets don't erase history. They acknowledge it. I'm open to structural transparency, I said calmly. Authorship clarity, documented approvals, clear retention boundaries. Specific, not emotional, he nodded. For the first time since I joined the company, the dynamic felt balanced. Not because he yielded authority, but because he recognized I had independent leverage. And here's the part most people don't talk about. Confrontation without heat is disorienting. When someone expects an emotional reaction and receives composure instead, they're forced to engage on substance. There was no apology, no dramatic reconciliation, just mutual awareness. When I left his office, nothing about the hallway looked different. But everything about the hierarchy had shifted, because authority is strongest when unquestioned. Once it's examined calmly and documented, it becomes accountable. And accountability changes posture. I didn't leave the company in a dramatic exit. There was no fiery resignation email, no public statement, no whisper campaign. 3 months after the audit closed, clean, documented, structurally intact, I accepted an external offer to lead governance architecture for a firm expanding its compliance division. The decision wasn't impulsive. It wasn't reactive. It was aligned. By the time I signed the contract, the internal atmosphere at my old company had stabilized. Retention policies were formalized. Documentation protocols were clearer. Executive correspondence required dual authorization. In some ways, the system was stronger than before. Daniel adjusted too. In final meetings before my departure, he credited me explicitly for the operational frameworks I had built, not extravagantly, not performatively, just accurately. I want to acknowledge that Violet designed the governance structure we've been refining, he said in one leadership session. Designed, authorship restored. But here's the truth. I no longer needed the acknowledgement. Because identity had shifted internally long before it shifted externally. I used to measure my value by whether recognition matched contribution. Now I measure it by whether my work is structurally undeniable. There's a difference. In my new role, I walk into boardrooms not as support infrastructure, but as an architect. I speak in complete sentences without softening language. I say, I designed this model, without flinching. Not because I've become louder, because I've become clearer. The emotional wound, the lifelong pattern of being spoken over, reframed, minimized, doesn't disappear overnight, but it transforms. I no longer fear invisibility. I understand it. Invisibility taught me observation. Observation taught me pattern recognition. Pattern recognition taught me protection. Protection gave me leverage. And leverage gave me calm. When I look back at that Tuesday morning, the empty archive, the clean server, the assumption of erasure, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude for the clarity it forced. Erasing evidence only works if you're the only one who has it. And in a broader sense, erasing someone's contribution only works if they rely on your narrative to define it. I don't anymore. Daniel and I exchanged a final handshake on my last day. No hard feelings? He asked. None, I said truthfully. Because quiet dominance isn't about resentment. It's about sovereignty. I didn't win. He didn't lose. The system recalibrated. And I chose an environment that matched the level of precision I bring. Who I am now isn't someone who tolerates invisibility. It's someone who understands when to observe, when to document, and when to move. Without noise, without spectacle, without bitterness. Just clarity. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's archival. Sometimes it's procedural. Sometimes it's the quiet discipline of keeping your own record when everyone assumes the system will remember for you. My boss deleted my entire email archive, believing perhaps that control of the server meant control of the story. But stories aren't stored in one place. They live in patterns, in timestamps, in the decisions you document when no one thinks you need to. I never exposed him publicly. I never humiliated him. I never raised my voice. I asked for clarity. I preserved continuity. I moved when alignment no longer matched my standards. That's what quiet dominance looks like. Not revenge, not destruction, not spectacle. Preparation. Because erasing evidence only works if you're the only one who has it. And erasing someone's contribution only works if they depend on your recognition to validate it. If you're in a space right now where you feel invisible, I want to say something gently. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless, but silence without strategy can become surrender. So document, clarify, ask for written confirmation. Protect your authorship, not because you expect betrayal, but because clarity is respect for yourself. I don't share this story to encourage paranoia. I share it to encourage precision. You don't need to burn bridges to protect yourself. You just need to build foundations that can't be quietly removed. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that someone was rewriting the narrative of your work? And if you had the chance to respond again, would you do it loudly or would you do it quietly?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.